So you have the question of how are you going to improve? Well, you saw a number of things in there. One, half the time we're kind of in my opinion, you're putting your center, regardless of who it is, in a disadvantage with the way they snap the football. And you see the hesitancy that he comes off with. So Josh has good feet, but there's so many times where you're trying to reorient yourself. And the guy you're playing against is really good. Like that's going to affect your ability to drive him off the ball. You saw that more often than not, especially as you maybe take a larger view of the entire season. Just the general demeanor of the team. Are we trying to cover up guys, or are we trying to move humans off the spot, right? There's just two fundamental ways you think about it from a lineman's perspective. I don't want to miss, or I want to drive the guy. I want to move this human off the spot. And I think we can really do that comes down to, one, how you draft. Are you drafting guys that have that mentality? Like, for example, this is a very easy one and a very obvious one, but Penei Sewell is not interested in covering you up. Penei Sewell is interested in moving you to a place you don't want to go, right? And he was been that way probably since he's in high school. So you can find those guys, and we have some of those guys for sure. But then you also have to coach and develop that by giving those guys the confidence that, hey, our footwork, our body position, our profile, we're going to teach us that you should be pre-snap always super confident that you're not going to miss. Because what are the two things that linemen what are the two confidence sources that they need the most? One, that in the run game, they don't just, miss their opponent. They don't whiff. And then two, they don't get bull rushed into the quarterback's lap in the pass pro. So like if you could give them those two skills and everything else didn't matter. You didn't teach anything else for the rest of the year. You gave them those two skills. I know that I can't get bull rushed, and I know that I'll never miss this guy. You're going to have some pretty good offensive linemen. I mean, they're going to start thinking for themselves. They're going to have a lot more confidence coming off the ball. You're going to get some dogs. So preaching the fundamentals, understanding the details of the sport, and just really adhering to those little things that make a big difference like they did on the film, I think will make these guys better. Now, to the question of who's actually going to be the starting five, Josh Myers is very well received and well loved in that locker room and in the meeting rooms. If I'm being honest, I think he'll make more money somewhere else, and it might be that time in his career where it's time to go somewhere else. I can't imagine Goody is going to overpay in this market for Josh. And because of that, you just have to wish him well. And who's the next guy? They drafted Jacob Monk last year. He might be ready to go. He's undersized, but he's got better footwork, better leverage, and he can certainly be one of those guys that you put in and think a little bit more of a people mover, okay? Despite the penalties that we saw in that Eagles game in particular, I might get skewered for this. I actually like what we saw from that rookie Glover and then the free agent from 23, Telford. I liked what I saw. I showed it on the tape. Are the hands terrible? Absolutely. Is the footwork good? What's the hard stuff about playing offensive line? Footwork, hip hinge, body position, angle of departure into contact. Those things they're all pretty good at, and they did a pretty good job. Particularly, you look at those double teams; they get to come back there. They do a really good job being the bumper. They get off to the second level well. Like I liked a lot of the stuff you see there. There's obviously work to be done, but I think both those guys can play. One of those guys is rookie. In fact, if you think about Monk, obviously Jordan Morgan, the first round pick, and Glover, they're all rookies, and then Telford's a second year guy. So the jump in this offseason, if they get with the right people and they really dramatically and drastically improve some of their just initial footwork and technique, I think all of those guys have a real chance if there's an opening at either the center or the guard position. What does that look like? Obviously, you can move Sean Ryan in. If you really liked Glover or Telford and you really liked him, you could move Elgton Jenkins, or you can move Elgton to right guard and move Sean in. Like I see those guards as being somewhat interchangeable. Although I think Elgton Jenkins is a really, really good football player. I think he's just as good if you give him the entire offseason on the right side. I think he might be just as good if you give him the entire offseason at center, as far as being effective in what you're trying to accomplish. And maybe one of those bigger guys, Glover in particular, maybe he's better at moving humans off the spot at the guard position than Jenkins is. So you might get some there. It's a really interesting thought experiment. The one thing you have to understand is I don't see the Packers not giving Jordan Morgan every opportunity to start this upcoming season. He's a first-round draft pick. If you look at, I did a small clip on this, but if you look at the draft picks since Jordan Love, who was, didn't start for 3 seasons and blah, 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 but is turning out to be a good player with a lot to work on, but a very good player. You've got Stokes, you've got Walker, you've got Wyatt, you got Lucas Van Ness, and you got Jordan Morgan. Now, some of those guys are starting. Some of those guys have been in and out of the lineup. Some of those guys are giving you production. I don't know that, just looking at first rounders, if any of those guys are people that you say these guys are going to be entrenched here for 8 years. Jordan Morgan, just by default of being the latest and also being a guy who could play, if he can play a guard position, you don't get rid of them. Like, he could be here for 5, 6, 7, 8 years very, very easily. He could be a guy you just go, okay, I'm just going to give him that next contract, and then boom. I don't know you can say that about the rest of these guys. So, Ron Wolf said something in his book that always resonates with me. It's like something to the effect of, you never admit you make a mistake on a first-round pick. So you always give those guys as many chances as you can. So I think you got to throw that in, just be realistic about, whether it's at right guard or, what that's going to look like. But he's going to get his, he's walking into a chance, I would imagine. Speaking of Myles Garrett, now, in Fantasyland, every team would want to have what I think is arguably the best defensive player in football. I think I've thought for the last couple of years he's by far the best all-around defensive end. Just holy hell, what can this guy do to destroy an offense? It would definitively change how the Packers are viewed defensively. What's the first thing that Josh Jacobs said? We need a defensive end. Okay. Well, not only would you get a defensive end, you would get a defensive end that would probably double the production of any other player you have on the defensive line. The question is, what would it cost? We can talk about cap in a second, but let's think about just from a trade deal. And I know there's numbers out there, but if you were to look at, Stokes, Wyatt, Walker, Van Ness, Morgan as your last, 4 years of picks? 4 years of picks. I would trade, and I think all those guys are contributing. They're good, look, NFL players, right? But Myles, there's very rarely, this is a Reggie White moment. Very rarely do you get an opportunity to get arguably the best defensive end in his generation to come to your team. I would trade at least 2 or 3 of those guys right off the bat. And if that meant, just based on the last 4 years and how you've drafted in the first round, would I trade my next 2 first-round picks to get Myles Garrett when he's 27 years old and I could renegotiate his contract, although I think he has multiple years left on it? Yeah, I would do it, and I wouldn't think twice about it. If I did nothing else for the offseason, except tried to, draft a defensive back, draft a wide receiver, draft another offensive lineman, you'd feel like, man, I got an A+ for this offseason. Because they really don't need that much. And I can't overemphasize what a difference it would make if you had a guy who, it really doesn't matter if you're trying to game plan for Myles Garrett or not, because Myles can play at literally every position across the offensive line. You want to beat the left tackle? Okay, you put the running back over there to chip. Okay, moves over to the right. I'm going to chip both sides. Okay, I'll go in and play against the guards. Like, you cannot hide from this guy. And because of that, he is always going to have numbers. And he's just going to enhance what they're able to do in the secondary from a passing perspective. So you don't need the DB if you get this guy. And I know a lot of guys are throwing around, Khalil Mack. Khalil's a hell of a good player, but Khalil's also, he just was thinking about retiring. It's like, why have a 1-year solution? Because if a guy's already thought about retiring, it's that thought is not going anywhere. And so if he's already thinking about that, let's go ahead and wish you the best of luck. I mean, you want to sign a 1-year deal, then you got the same problem next year. Where right now you could do something that will change the outcome of this franchise, I guaranteed, for the next 2 to 3 years. Now, the Packers have about $42 million in cap space today, give or take. Garrett's sitting on, I want to say, $19 million for 2025. There's a bunch of dead money and blah, 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 blah. You're likely going to have to renegotiate his contract. But again, here's the thing. He is the best defensive player in the National Football League. I mean, depending on how, for an offensive lineman, he's the one guy, Chris Jones, where you go, holy, okay, we got a real problem. It's the equivalent, and I don't say this lightly, we brought in Reggie White. It made a huge difference in this franchise, right? Kind of a generational type pass rusher. What is it worth? And I guess the bigger question is, do you think the Packers are one big move away? And the answer for me is, with the development of the guys on offense, yes, you're one big player away if it's the pass rushing defensive end on defense. So the last couple, we just got biggest questions heading into the 2025 season. And I think everybody's asked this question. I just kind of brought it up without meaning to. Do the Packers need to change their draft strategy, especially in the first round? Is this kind of, or as you look at, even the offensive line, is it a development issue, or are they just kind of missing the boat on the personalities? I'll say this, and I didn't know this until I moved teams. I went to another team when I was playing, and I had been in Green Bay, and we did not have, I've said this before, we didn't have guys who were just go to biker bars and, smoke Pall Malls, like tough guys. But all of especially Marco and Mike, and then there's the confidence that a super athlete like Chad had, and just, Mark Tauscher, just a guy who still, defies so many things, could not get beat, was unbeatable, I had that confidence. But we had a group that had such a level of confidence and conditioning that we could, because a lot of this, finishing, being a fourth quarter team, all of that, a lot of it has to do with can you breathe in the fourth quarter? I went to another team though, and everybody had a little bit of asshole in them. And I think you need that. And you see with most of the good guys, they got a little bit of asshole to them. I went to another team that had some really just good dudes. They just drafted good people. And, it was difficult because sometimes you're drafting guys who are just really, really good humans, and they don't know how to be assholes on the field. And I don't, I've never been in the locker room with these guys. I have no idea. But I do know that it's a rarity where you see guys, and you saw it from the young guys, and maybe that's why I latched on and said I liked them even though they're getting some holding penalties. But you don't see a lot of guys trying to just bulldoze you into the pile, trying to finish you every time. You don't see guys trying to physically dominate the other person. If it so happens that the guy has a bad foot, a bad step, and he's off balance and it worked, okay, great. But it's am I trying to just punish you every time I get a chance to punish you? Because I showed it in the tape, there are very specific times based on scheme and alignment where you should be trying to punish people. And are you drafting people that want to punish? And are you drafting people that embrace the grind of learning the scheme, watching tape, all that stuff, and at every position? I don't know the answer to that, but I would say that the philosophy that it seems like they're having, and especially in the first round, of let's bring in guys who are projects, when time shows, history tells that there have been players available who can come in and have an immediate, long-lasting impact that are still there on the draft board. That's a really, really tough one to reconcile for a guy who's done a phenomenal job in almost every way with Goody. So I think I would change my draft philosophy. I really have so much respect for the Detroit Lions and how they go about constructing their team. And just the idea of I'm going to take what I think is the best football player that fits the needs of our team. I don't care what the position is. I love that. I don't care what everybody else says, because look at how many great players they have, Pro Bowl, All Pro, all division guys that they've drafted for second, third round, like safety, linebacker, running back. It's like nobody drafts those guys, tight end. Nobody drafts those guys as high as they did. They all got, kind of dumped on for it. And then they all turned out to be players. If you watch their tape in college, it was like, oh yeah, they're the best player on the field. Well, why isn't anybody drafting him? Oh, it's not how we do it. So it's tough. It's tough. The other question everybody has is, what are the biggest improvements going to come from if this is to be a championship team? If you just close your eyes and say, hey, 6 months from now, we just go into the lab. Everybody goes into their own lab, or we go collectively, and we come out. We're the best versions of ourselves. Where are you going to see those bumps? Where's going to be most obvious? And honestly, I think one of them is going to be quarterback. We talked about it even in the last game, but all of this season is kind of the footwork, a little bit of the decision making. We talked about it earlier. Might be part of that problem. Might be the wide receiver room, but everything starts with how you put power into the ground. And despite some of the throwing styles of my guy and Jordan's predecessor, you got to start with your foundational footwork. You got to start with just doing the basic stuff at the highest level, and then you have opportunities to make these real special plays. And sometimes it's like Pat Mahomes has kind of thrown everybody for a loop because he's so different, he's so talented, and that arm is just a little bit better than everybody else's. But the reality is, for the majority of humans on the planet, having this solid base footwork, core tight, being able to transfer power to your throwing motion, that's going to make you a better football player. And there's too many bad throws that you see where he's throwing off back foot, et cetera, et cetera. So, I think there's a lot of growth that's available there. Obviously we talked about the pass rush. You've got to, whatever is in Rashawn Gary, and I know he made the Pro Bowl, but to get more out of him from just, I'm going to consistently beat the person in front of me over and over and over again. I think losing Preston was a big deal, quite frankly. And then the demeanor of the offensive line. I mean, you look at, like we talked about it already, but you look at, kind of everywhere else, can you pick up a corner? Do you need an Alexander healthy, et cetera? Yeah, of course. But, you like what the linebacker room did. Now losing Campanelli, or I think that's his name, the linebacker coach, I think that's a huge deal. I would say that from a coach development standpoint, maybe that's the biggest question, because I think they made the biggest jump year one to year two in Hafley's defense, and now you're losing that guy. And I think he was a really, really special coach. I think he did some amazing things in that room. And so whoever comes in and fills that gap, you're really going to, because there's still question marks going into the offseason. Who are they going to keep? Is McDuffie going to be there? Is Wilson going to be there? I mean, Quay's going to, I'm sure, be able to walk into that job with Cooper. What does that look like? Who's your third guy? Are you going to be situational again? Are you going to have to point Quay downhill, or are we going to get him to the point where he's more, he has the instincts of an Edgerrin Cooper? Or is that even possible? So many questions. But, the takeaway from the last game that I had was, can this team function and win against a really physical football team? And, as it was constructed and as they put on the field against, whether it's whether the Eagles, the Lions, etc., the answer was we need to tweak a couple things. And the cool thing about the offseason is, each individual can go to the lab and come back out and say, look what I've done. Look what I've worked on. Look at what I've added to my game. Look at the confidence that I have now. And that's the challenge. It's a lot of this is a roster construction, and that's exciting. I mean, it's fun to talk about as a fan, but I honestly, guys don't care. If their buddies coming to the team, or you get like a Myles Garrett, it's great. But the reality is, how good can I get, and what am I willing to do? And the hope is that the team, the organization, the general manager, personnel department are bringing in the kind of guys that are just desperate to show you how good they're getting. And so that's the hope. Thanks to BetOnline, our sponsor. Thanks to all you guys who are watching. Check me out at Michael68 on Twitter, Process to Perform on Instagram. Check out our YouTube channel. Subscribe, rate, and review to that if you're enjoying this. Yeah, big things ahead, guys. This will be fun.